Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode I discuss political philosophy with two non-philosopher friends, Adam and Giffin, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. So, with that introduction, please enjoy our discussion of political philosophy. So today we're talking about this excerpt. It's funny. I'm not actually entirely clear on what type of piece of media this is. I mean, it's an essay by Isaiah Berlin called "Two Concepts of Liberty," and we're just reading and discussing the first two main sections of this, where he puts forth his very, very famous notion of positive and negative liberty, but this is an essay that is part of it's a book called Liberty by Isaiah Berlin, and it's incorporating 4 essays on liberty. It's published by Oxford University Press. You can find it online if you just search 4 essays on liberty Berlin PDF. So I think that what we're talking about is probably pretty and arguably the most popular excerpt from that. And it's obviously very, very germane to any political philosophy or discussion of I was thinking a lot about the Anderson paper, actually, when we were reading this. So first, out of first impressions before we get into it, I thought that this was a very interesting and also very quotable paper. He had a great writing style.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was honestly such a welcome change from Marx, in the sense that this prose was so clear. I just felt like whenever I don't know, there was something about Berlin's writing style that I think I just understood what he said the first time. You know what I mean? Versus like Marx, where it was like, I really wasn't sure what Marx was saying at the time.
Yeah, I don't think we'll need to be filling in many blanks, like just a huge body of literature just to understand the definitions used. Like it was very clear. I enjoyed it. I was familiar with the concepts, but I never read this, so it was good to actually read it, and it was good style.
And it's funny that you guys remark on the style, because I mean, in that sort of like prelude to the 2 sections, he does deride analytic philosophy a little bit. He talks about these people have whittled down. I wrote like a little note to myself. I was like, I wonder how despondent he'd be at the state of philosophy today. He talks about people have just whittled their whole intellectual lives down to just counterexample of a counterexample of a Frankfurt case or whatever. And he says that my goal in this paper is to really kind of step outside or step back of a lot of the debate and really kind of lay this groundwork that he says has been conflated and overlooked in the past, these 2 concepts of liberty.
And also I've heard this paper referenced, and I've heard like the positive and negative freedoms expressed before and what they mean. I think though the positive definition of freedom that I've heard is a little bit different than how he puts it in this paper, right? Like I read that section twice just to make sure I understood what he was saying, but I think I can understand how people have derived a modern sense of positive freedom from what he said, but it's not the same. It's not the same. I
really want to talk about that. Yeah.
Would you guys agree with that?
No,
you kind of got that too?
I read this and I was like, I've been made aware of the concept. Like I've heard the terms positive and negative freedoms used before, in political discourse. But reading this, it was like slightly off of my expectations. So I don't know if I honestly, it'll be useful to clarify even like what those expectations were in the first place. Cause it was kind of like, in the past I've, heard these and it was just kind of like off. So maybe you can clarify, Adam, if you have specific things that you're expecting.
Yeah. Should we jump into that right now, or
we can,
or do we want to wait?
I see no reason why we can't talk about the positive conception first. Cause let's say really quickly, let's just say really quickly. I mean, we'll circle back and talk about it, but negative freedom is essentially freedom from coercion. It's freedom from external someone like Eddie Namias might call this kind of bypassing of your rational interests or like what you want to do. It's bypassing that, it's subjugation. But yeah.
And also like if you're going to define the parameters of this negative sense of freedom, it's, as Berlin puts it, or he might be, kind of rephrasing someone else's ideas too, but he kind of describes it as this kind of enclosed plane that is secured liberty, such that, no political or social force or any other person can sort of trespass on this enclosed plane that we would kind of define as free from coercion. So if that makes any sense there.
It does. And I'll just add one last thing, and then we can skip to positive freedom. He says this was one of the kind of nice, necessary, and sufficient conditions. He says that there are, now I'm paraphrasing him, there's 3 aspects to coercion. It involves deliberate interference from another human being within the area in which I could have acted other than I did. So that is really how he's defining negative freedom there.
Yeah, this did remind me of Anderson a bit in the way she kind of described oppression as social. It kind of was similar.
Yeah. Okay. So let's circle back around to that, because I think that I understood very well the negative freedom, and I have a lot of kind of, notes and stuff to talk about, but I want to make sure that I was understanding what he's talking about by positive freedom. So
I agree with that. Yeah, because I think that's the less clear part of this paper.
Totally agree. And it's the less clear both in the paper and in kind of the contemporary conversation about freedom and liberty, like you were talking about.
Should we discuss that real fast? Just like what the contemporary, like what I've heard personally.
Yeah, do that first. Yeah.
Because so from what I've heard, the positive freedom has been defined in such a way as almost like capability.
Yeah.
And like in the sense that, I've often heard, as an example, how free is someone that is just left in the desert with no resources? You're free ultimately to do whatever you'd like, but there isn't much to do other than you're free to die. Right. So
I like the use of capabilities. That maps on pretty well, I think,
to the Anderson paper too.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that how
that sounds like a contemporary? It's like practical ability to do something.
Yes.
Right. Like, and the conversation that I would have heard is something like, someone who's impoverished, like they may like not be like prevented from doing something by like another person, but practically like there are several unobtainable kind of things or goods or experiences, etc., that like they just can't access. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in the context of social policy, especially, right? Like that would be something they invoked to like say, well, we should have public libraries or something, anything like that. Right. Access to this constitutes a freedom. Right.
Yeah.
I agree. So, okay, I want to understand how Berlin's definition is differentiated, even in degree, if not in totality or type from that. So maybe actually, because this is a very quotable paper, maybe I'm just going to quote a bit at length of where he introduces the positive notion of freedom. Please. So this is just at that section. He says, the positive sense of the word liberty derives from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. I wish my life and decisions to depend on myself, not on external forces of whatever kind. I wish to be the instrument of my own, not of other men's acts of will. I wish to be a subject, not an object, to be moved by reasons, by conscious purposes, which are my own, not by causes which affect me, as it were, from the outside. I wish to be somebody, not nobody, a doer, deciding, not being decided for, self-directed, and not acted upon by external nature or by other men, as if I were a thing or an animal or a slave incapable of playing a human role, that is, of conceiving goals and policies of my own and realizing them. I actually didn't have a note of this, but he's almost saying like, this is kind of the difference between the reactive and objective attitudes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It does feel like that.
it feels a little bit like that.
And I want you to pause there real fast because I think we can see some of like the modern conception of positive freedom at the very end of that sentence there,
Yes.
where it's of conceiving goals and policies of my own and realizing them.
Yeah.
So it's not just the conception, but it's the capability to realize goals.
Yeah,
and
that's the
policies of one's own. So I sentences like that, I think you can see how a positive conception of or I'm sorry, a modern conception of positive freedom kind of emerges from this paper.
Oh yeah, you're totally those two words carry a lot of weight.
Yeah.
Because so I was just kind of making self examples with this, and it's like I want to determine. And when I wrote determine, I think I was implicitly meaning both conceive of and realize, because if I conceive of all these things and they don't come to fruition, in some sense, I haven't really exercised my positive freedom there. But it's like, all of us kind of have these ideas of conceiving of what career you want to have, what place in the country or what country you want to live in, that stuff like, do I want to get married, the number of kids you want to have, those sorts of things are very readily accessible examples, I think, to a lot of people of what he's talking about here. There was, skipping a sentence, there was another great quote from him. He says, I wish above all to be conscious of myself as a thinking, willing, active being, bearing responsibility for my choices and able to explain them by reference to my own ideas and purposes. I feel free to the degree that I believe this to be the true, and enslaved to the degree that I am made to realize that it is not. That I just thought that was really interesting there.
And you can see the modern conception emerge again there too, where it's just focusing on bearing responsibility for my choices and able to explain them by reference to my own ideas and purposes. So ultimately, whether you succeed or fail in something, you're not going to, in this circumstance, maybe blame your poverty, your upbringing or your circumstances there. It's more so, I was able to carry this out, based on my own constitution ultimately, or I did based on my own constitution ultimately.
So I have a question then. So the way I was thinking about this a little bit, this was like I was trying to get my hands on the conception here. Okay, so it seems like there are a lot of probably innumerable things that I do not have the positive freedom to obtain in this sense, right? So I do not have the positive freedom. I can conceive of this goal, but I can't realize it, to become an astronaut, right? You just need certain requirements for that I just am not going to have, right? A pro basketball player is also going to fit into that, However, there are probably also many things that do fall in the realm of what I am capable of, but then I do not desire to pursue. So, for instance, I could probably be a middle manager at Amazon. If I really wanted to be, I probably have those abilities, right? So it seems like what he's talking about is within the scope of what is practically feasible. And then you can slice within that too, to include those things which you conceive of or desire to do, and that you have the ability to do. And within that, for most people, most of the time, there are still, to use the Borges term, there's multiple forks of that branch, pragmatically speaking, for them. Does that that's a little bit of how I was thinking about it? Does that seem apocryphal from the text?
No, I think that makes sense then.
Okay, good.
I see how you can draw that from the text there.
Okay.
And almost like kind of go based on your example of like, say like the Amazon middle manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you would bear responsibility for your choice there because you can conceive of that goal. You could realize it, but you're able to explain your choices by reference to your own ideas and purposes.
Yeah.
Right. So you do in fact have the positive freedom to become an Amazon middle manager. You just don't, you don't exercise, I guess you would just have that positive freedom. You just wouldn't you wouldn't
exercise it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you wouldn't be
Yeah.
exercising the freedom. That's exactly
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
And I guess, okay, so importantly also then, even if you endorse something in like a Frankfurtian second order desire sense, but you didn't actually exercise any control over it, that doesn't seem to be a positive freedom, right? So let's say, like Adam, you're a good example of this. You're like what, 6'1", 6'2", or whatever. So
Yeah, no.
let's assume that you're happy with being that height, or you don't wake up lamenting the fact that you're 6'1", right?
It's true.
Exactly. So, but you didn't have any control over that. So that wouldn't be an example of an exercising of positive freedom, even if you endorse it.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I actually had a question about this.
Yeah.
So we were talking about like the first paragraph of the notion of positive freedom section. And the beginning of the next paragraph is something that kind of made me uncertain as to whether like that's the full story of positive freedom. It says the freedom which consists in being one's own master, and the freedom which consists in not being prevented from choosing as I do by any other man, may, on the face of it, seem concepts at no great logical distance from each other. So this is referencing the positive and negative freedoms, but the first line seems to be referencing the positive notion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being one's own master. And that didn't seem to map on as well to like what we had discussed and stressed in the previous part. It's almost like self-discipline is what it sounded like there, instead of like practical, capabilities or, ability to exercise, things like that. Did you guys read that as problematic or confusing?
That
I read
thought came
that as
up
the same.
later.
I think I read that as very similar to the first paragraph there. I think he's just kind of rephrasing it. I guess what's your issue with that little part right there?
It was just like kind of minor, I guess, but it didn't seem to be a proper, in my view, distillation of the previous paragraph. Like to me, like whether or not you can like exercise something doesn't seem to be like whether you're one's own master.
I guess like the first sentence in the first paragraph, like he kind of defines what it means to be your own master in that sense. Because like he says, like the positive sense of the word liberty derives from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. And then he kind of goes on to describe what he means by that.
Okay, I guess that makes sense.
I mean? I guess
yeah,
that's
it's just like I guess the phrasing seemed like a little off. Like it doesn't seem like you can say in conclusion, it's being one's own master. It's like I don't know.
I actually had questions about that, Giffin, because it appeared later in the text.
Okay,
it appeared. So he introduces the fact that positive and negative freedoms can come into conflict with each other, right?
Okay. Yeah, maybe that's what we can go to.
And I actually had some notes that were like directly about what you were saying there. Because I realized that I've actually used this concept before of an all things considered best self. So this is the bottom of page 179. Excuse me, sir. This is the bottom of page 179. He says, but what gives such plausibility as it has to this kind of language is that we recognize that it is possible and at times justifiable to coerce men in the name of some goal, let us say justice or public health, which they would, if they were more enlightened, themselves pursue, but do not, because they are blind or ignorant or corrupt. And he'll go on to point out the dangers, I think, of that.
Oh, he does.
View.
Yeah, that was surprising almost, honestly.
Yes. So I wanted to talk about this because this does seem to address the kind of self-master issue that you were raising. I've actually unwittingly made use in my own, just kind of like just thinking about things. And I think I've probably raised this with you, Adam, in various conversations in the past, but I really have thought a lot in terms of kind of the all things considered or enlightened self. The last sentence of that going into the next page, he says, what at most this entails is that they would not resist me if they were rational and wise as I and understood their interests as I do. So,
yeah. Actually, just one quick note back to Anderson again. This seems like the kind of paternalism point here being brought up, right?
Yes.
Totally agree with that.
And if you recall, I haven't edited that episode.
I do recall. That's why I bring it up.
Well, the joke was there that I may not recall, remember, because that was the brain fog episode.
Oh, I actually completely forgot that was the brain fog.
If So if I recall, I guess I should have said, uh, I was actually very okay. Remember, I think that she had accused this, she had used the accusation of paternalism as this really kind of devastating critique.
Mhm.
But I was really, really okay with it. And I think lurking in the background of the fact that I was okay with it is that I've used this concept of kind of the enlightened rational self before in a lot of my
Right.
thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So he points out that what he's talking about when he talks about there's two senses of there's that kind of all things considered. He doesn't use this language specifically, but I took him as almost pointing to, if you were able to live out both types of experience and experience both, which one would you choose as sort of the mill higher order pleasure, right? So like, Giffin, if you could live out, you're sort of debating what to do with your day.
Sure.
You have two options. You could go to a few museums in Pittsburgh and spend the day kind of contemplating art and history, or you could lounge in bed and watch Netflix.
Yeah.
I feel like he doesn't use this language, but the way I interpreted that point is there's this very pragmatic notion of your most rational self or your most enlightened self, where if you experience both of those days and then you're kind of reset with the experience, which would you choose to have, right? And the assumption there is that obviously you choose to go to the museums and kind of better yourself,
Mhm.
right? But he seems to juxtapose that pragmatic sense with, there's this other kind of best self, which is almost this Kantian noumenal self, this pure will, right? It's like definitionally in that is that a kind of a pure will abstracted from all of the dirty phenomenon of the real world would actually just intrinsically be rational. It's like, and they're related but different.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to like his description of being one's own master, like in
Yeah.
the sense that you're able to, conceptualize ideas and then realize them
Mm.
as well. So, and it's like he does kind of like mention just an area in which this paternalism could take place, something like healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like you could imagine, okay, well, if the state were to encroach upon, your decision whether to, get healthcare or not and just provide healthcare to you, then if we were to take it as fact that if providing healthcare to you, which you otherwise wouldn't have, would allow you to navigate the world better
Yeah.
and, conceptualize goals and realize those goals, you almost sort of you just kind of seize hold of your life more at that point.
You've
you
granted positive freedom to that person.
You have, exactly, by encroaching on their negative freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah.
So it's like that's how I
here.
interpreted that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, this is like almost like the point of the paper is that he kind of lays out these two freedoms and then says there will be trade-offs, and you can't just kind of like say that they're, abstractly like freedom is increasing. It's like, no, there actually is a cost, and it's like intellectually dishonest to just kind of say like freedom has been increased here. It's like, well, there's been a trade-off here actually.
Exactly.
Which I much prefer. I'm super on board with this framing.
I want to get to that point, but circling back to the thing that you raised, Giffin, because what I said was setting it up.
Oh yeah, right.
But in the next paragraph, I'm just going to quote almost the whole thing because it's really good.
Where is this? I'm sorry.
This is on page 180. Yeah,
second. The paradox. This paradox.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Because he says this paradox has been often exposed. It is one thing to say that I know what is good for X, while he himself does not, and even to ignore his wishes for its and his sake. And a very different one to say that he has ipso facto chosen it, not indeed consciously, not as he seems in everyday life, but in his role as a rational self, which his empirical self may not know, the real self, which discerns this good and cannot help choosing it once it is revealed. This monstrous impersonation, which consists in equating what X would choose if he were something he is not, or at least not yet, with what X actually seeks and chooses, is at the heart of all political theories of self-realization. So, continuing, it is one thing to say that I may be coerced for my own good, which I am too blind to see. This may on occasion be for my benefit. Indeed, it may enlarge the scope of my liberty. Okay. This was, so I was kind of thinking about this at first in the terms that you laid out, Giffin, with like being one's own master. So, I so he's almost kind of making he's almost making the point that, like, look, don't say that you're not coercing someone to provide them positive freedoms because you're increasing their freedom. You have to actually, he's asking us to kind of bite the bullet here and say, like, if you're going to restrict negative freedoms to grant people positive freedoms, you've got to be honest about what you're doing there. And I was thinking about this with respect to the self-master point that you raised, and I kind of do think about this, and it's very amenable to a Frankfurtian kind of second order desire way of looking at this too, where sometimes I or other people will coerce me for my own good. Like sometimes if you have, if you have someone who goes to the gym with you all the time, say, and if you don't go, they're going to give you shit, and it's like you're a flaker, and that's a really good form of coercion, but it is coercion. They're trying to, in those positive examples, you're instilling a positive freedom, right? That the peace of having worked out, like we all know that feeling.
Yeah, it's like you're beating back down the lower nature that he talks about on the previous page,
yeah.
Right? Like the pursuit of immediate pleasures, irrational impulse, uncontrolled desires.
Yeah, but he can, and this is where I thought it was very interesting, and I thought about it more on a interpersonal level. He continues, it is another to say that if it is my good, then I am not being coerced, for I have willed it, whether I know this or not. And I am free, or truly free, even while my poor earthly body and foolish mind bitterly reject it. So here's what I read that to be saying. So he's saying that if you operate on that second, what he calls monstrous impersonation view, that would be saying that forcing me to go to the gym isn't actually forcing me to go because my pure will or my ideal rational self would rationally want that. But if that's true, then there's this kind of like Isaiah Berlin, which we'll read this paper at some point, but there's this like annihilation of the individual, because if that's true, everyone should be coerced into doing what is ultimately the peak of rationality, the apotheosis of what's rational, right? But that would almost deny the very individuality that we have in the first place, that defines kind of people's goods. So he's saying, like, look, you can't coerce people in the name of positive freedom and pretend that it's not coercion. If you're going to do it, you've got to bite that bullet.
Yeah.
Which I think is a good point.
Yeah, totally. And it seems totally true that people do that all the time, especially in the modern political arena, is just like, just kind of wave off like the actual trade-off that's happening and just kind of describe it's like we are, like, these people are not, and it's super tempting. Like, I know I've done it. It's like you're not acting in your rational self-interest. And because like it is very clear empirically that this would have a positive effect, like you can object, but it will be done. Over your objection, and then that is like the justification, but that's not the proper framework. And it's kind of, well, he doesn't use the term, but again, it is a little bit paternalistic, in the way we previously discussed.
Do you know what I thought about? A perfect example of this is. Do you know how we had to get those certain vaccinations to be able to attend like elementary school? There's like meningitis and I don't know what they all are. That's a perfect example of you actually have to have negative freedoms restricted there for, in this case, it's just positive freedoms. of being able to this is what facilitates us to attend school, which facilitates every other opportunity in your life. And you don't have the ability to say like my body, my choice about the meningitis.
It's like it's not even that you're preventing like yourself. Like you're preventing other children from dying.
Like, that's why I chose that, because it's just a pristine example.
Right. 100%. But again, like you cannot in good faith kind of say that you're simply increasing freedom. It's like it is a small amount of negative freedom, I'd say, for a grand positive freedom. And I mean, it's very hard to kind of argue against that. But it has to be the trade-off framework. Otherwise, it's not accurate.
Exactly, because you're free to navigate your academic career.
Yes,
the rest of your life.
Exactly, but just like without worrying about such things as like meningitis, right?
Yeah.
So, but you've coerced people so they no longer have the freedom to not take the vaccines in that case.
Yeah, so, we don't want polio-ridden like elementary schools.
Maybe you don't.
Very paternalistic of me.
Yeah. Anderson would like that.
I understand what he's saying here, but I'm not sure how I feel about it. So let me read this part again that you just read, Jordan. Okay. It is another to say that if it is my good, then I am not being coerced, or I have willed it, whether I know this or not, and am free or truly free, even while my poor earthly body and foolish mind bitterly reject it and struggle with the greatest desperation against those who seek, however benevolently, to impose it. So like, I understand that he's saying, okay, let's see here. So then I am not being coerced, for I have willed it. So I understand that he's saying like, okay, your true rational self would will this behavior or this coercion. So you're not coerced in that sense. But I'm not sure I like the framing there. I don't know, because it's like, I understand that he's appealing to this master self almost of you, where it's like you recognize that.
I made a mistake there. I just realized when you were repeating it, I think I misspoke. I should have said Bernard Williams-esque point. I think I just repeated the name Isaiah Berlin point.
You did. Okay.
I was going to comment.
No, I totally misspoke there. So I think that he's actually making a really similar point to this really great paper. We haven't read it yet. I've referenced it all the time. We do. This Bernard Williams point, where he says that it's actually very much of a piece with this point. He says that, so, you look at these kind of ethical theories, right? Consequentialism, Kantian deontological, right? So he makes the point that those theories have a deep, deep internal contradiction in them. And I think Isaiah Berlin is pointing to that contradiction here, where he says, okay, look, consequentialism, there's only going to be, or deontology, whatever you want, there's only going to be one right answer. There's only one maximization of utility, right? So if that is the thing that the theory demands, that is that thing which you must do. However, the entire idea of choosing to adopt a framework or not, or to make a choice or not, is contingent on the idea of an individual, which by necessitating only one correct moral move, it destroys the idea of moral agency in the first place. And I took
to make sense, yeah.
And I took Berlin to be making a very similar point where he's saying, if you say that something can't be bad for you, if it's what your rational self would, endorse, right? So it's like, I can subjugate you in any which way I want, as long as your rational best self would endorse it. There's a very similar point being made here where, okay, there's, if you actually adopt that view, there's only going to be one ultimately just most rational life to live, right? And that would destroy the very concept of individuality that you're asking to sort of subjugate people to. I took it as a very similar point in that way.
Yeah, I think he wraps it up in like the final paragraph here. I think he calls that the magical transformation.
I had that highlighted. Yeah, I really like that quote.
Giffin, read that paragraph there.
Okay. Do you mean to start from the beginning of the paragraph? I think
this magical transformation.
Yeah.
So good.
This magical transformation, or sleight of hand, for which William James so justly mocked the Hegelians, can no doubt be perpetrated just as easily with the negative concept of freedom. where the self that should not be interfered with is no longer the individual with his actual wishes and needs as they are normally conceived, but the real man within, identified with the pursuit of some ideal purpose not dreamed of by his empirical self.
That's exactly what I was pulling from there. Is I think that's the point where he's saying, he's almost making like a slippery slope argument, which is not a fallacy in this case, where he's saying, if you grant that you can't wrong someone if it's in their best rational self-interest, well, then that just opens the floodgates, because why would any instance be outside the scope of that principle then? Like everyone would sort of degenerate into the ultimate rational being, and then you could just coerce people into anything, but that would just destroy the very concept of who we are in the first place. So it's like it almost bites its tail in that way.
The sleight of hand there is that like you've kind of changed the assumptions entirely to the point where it's like not internally consistent anymore.
Yes.
Right. Whenever you invoke the you, like that's been destroyed.
Yeah, exactly. Who's the me in the like the all possible things considered best rational self? That's just the rational self at that point.
Yeah. Do you want me to continue reading?
Sure. Yeah. That was where that part.
That part's important.
Specifically,
I know the part at the end is kind of what was highlighted by me, but I'll just continue to get there. And as in the case of the positively free self, this entity may be inflated into some superpersonal entity, a state, a class, a nation, or the march of history itself, regarded as a more real subjective attributes than the empirical self. But the positive conception of freedom as self-mastery, with its suggestion of a man divided against himself, has in fact, as a matter of history, of doctrine and of practice, lend itself more easily to this splitting of personality into two, the transcendent dominant controller and the empirical bundle of desires and passions to be disciplined and brought to heel. It is this historical fact that has been influential. And then this is the part that kind of I highlighted. This demonstrates, if demonstration of so obvious a truth is needed, that conceptions of freedom directly derive from views of what constitutes a self, a person, a man. Enough manipulation of the definition of man and freedom can be made to mean whatever the manipulator wishes. Recent history has made it only too clear that the issue is not merely academic. And that's kind of like where we were talking about before, is like in the sleight of hand you've reconstituted a man or a self. So that's not like the point of what the debate should be. Like you can get to whatever end you want if you kind of just like sneakily change like all of the underlying framework, right? If you redefine like a self, a being, like you can justify anything. Is what he's saying here. And when was this written, Jordan? Do you know?
This was original. This was based off of a lecture given in
58.
50, I was gonna say 57.
Okay.
7?
I was gonna say like 60s, but
1957.
Okay.
Yeah, so the lecture was 57. I think he was appointed in Oxford in 58, right? Or no? Okay.
The essay, I'll just read it. The essay is based on an inaugural lecture delivered in 1958. Berlin succeeded G.D.H. Cole in this chair in 57, so it's just the reverse.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you guys about that last point, though, that Giffin said, because I will bring it back to the Thomas Nagel paradox again. I feel like all three of us have been guilty of this style of better self-reasoning, but I also don't know that it's always wrong. Like,
can you give an example?
Sure. So we're all, we all are on the left about most issues, right? And so, one of those issues would be, I mean, let's just go back to the easy case, I guess, is requiring vaccination for, attending a school.
Sure.
It's like to do that. I don't know. Okay. So here's what I'm wondering about. It's like, okay, there's a very obvious way in which that is obviously justified in terms of sacrificing a minuscule amount of negative freedom for an incredibly large amount of positive freedom. Mm-hmm. So in that way, I don't think that there's any contest between our thinking and Berlin's. But when you ask, how do you justify that trade-off? doesn't the justification of that reduce to that person's kind of enlightened self? It's like you might think as some, anti-vax mother in the suburbs or whatever, to use a trope, right? That,
Sure.
oh, like, no, my baby can't, the meningitis vaccine, the polio, the smallpox vaccine, whatever it is, right? Like, but actually you're wrong about that. And when we say you're wrong about that, we actually mean that you would be better off if you didn't believe that. And regardless of what you believe, we're going to make your kid get the smallpox vaccine because that's how our society has to operate.
Sure. No, I totally agree with that. I think I fully get Berlin at this point, though, where he's saying, like, okay, whenever you've got a circumstance like that, we're not saying like one is better than the other. Like in this case, we're saying it is better to, coerce individuals to maximize positive freedom in this sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's always important to recognize that there is that trade-off and that
Mm-hmm.
we always can't just, we can't maximize positive freedom, or that can't be the rationale in every single circumstance to maximize positive freedom at the expense of negative freedom.
Of course, because that degenerates into the condition he said.
Sure.
Here's my question, though. When you say that is a valid trade-off, obviously I agree with you, but isn't the underlying justification of saying it's a better trade-off predicated on that very notion of the enlightened best self?
I don't know that it is.
I'm almost failing to wonder how it could be justified because, okay, there's let's table it. There's an obvious way in which you can justify it by protecting other people,
like consequences, right?
Sure,
just
yeah.
The consequences.
But I do think that there's something also sneaking in there where and even if it's not okay, I don't know that this was part of the reasoning behind that mandate or whatever. But here's the thing: I kind of think that it's right that those people would actually be better off if they didn't believe that the meningitis vaccine would kill their child or whatever they believe. They actually would be better off, and undoubtedly, I would be better off if fill in the blank. Right.
I don't know that he contests. Like you said, like, but here's the thing. I do think that they would be better off. I don't. Yeah. Does Berlin contest that?
That's the thing that I'm not exactly clear about. So, okay. I mean, we've got the two senses of, best self, right? There's that really pragmatic one, which is, right. So it is one thing to say that I know what is good for X while he himself does not. And even to ignore his wishes for its and his sake. So when he says for his sake too, because he's juxtaposing that. So here's what I'm not basing it off of. If he were rational, he would have chosen that. That is like that very lofty one that he points out can just be justified for anything, right? But when he says that we do something for someone else's sake, even if they don't see that it's for that, I'm almost reading that as that like the paternalistic way of you don't understand what's good for you with respect to this, but through this you're going to be made better off, right? It isn't that just another way of saying if we could have prevented you from it's like, I think not far away from granting that is granting the statement, you would have been better off to have never believed that in the first place, right?
Sorry, I'm like rereading this paragraph.
Sure, I don't know.
I know. I agree with you. I'm just thinking right now.
I know there's some really slippery way in which it creeps in.
Because like that's not the reason like that we make any of like these kind of social prescriptions, right? Like,
sure.
Like the reason we do, all of them is like consequentialism, like in a sense, but at the same time, you can look at it through a different lens. It's not the reason why we do it, but from this different lens, you could say, okay, yes,
well, even then,
they're able to now send their children to school not fearing that their kid gets meningitis. And there's a freedom, a positive freedom associated with that. And that entails that, yes, their rational self would have made that decision.
Yes.
Right. So I agree with that. Like if you look at it through that lens. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not 100% sure how to think about like the rational self in this. Honestly, in the whole paper, like Berlin's point in invoking it. But I don't know if it's necessarily a different lens when you frame it like that. I think the idea of the positive and the negative freedoms kind of wraps into the consequentialism, right? You can say like, if you value, I mean, and this might be the thing that is smuggled in, Jordan, from your perspective, like different people will value like positive and negative freedom differently. But those kind of things are in that consequentialism. That decision is like those values, like is part of the calculus or whatever. That makes sense. It's like you can't conceive of it out. Like you can't conceive of it without having both of those sides being addressed.
But here's what I want to kind of bring up though, Giffin. I could be wrong about this, but I kind of got from his section here that the positive freedom aspect is almost like a psychological state.
I wasn't sure. Yeah,
I kind of got it that it was more of like you are your own master at this point. It essentially you are navigating the world at kind of almost like a higher level. Like
but it can't be baseless, right? It's got to be actually grounded in some real actuality of you doing those things.
Well, I'm not sure because he does use. I mean, this is what I was bringing up with the self mastery. I don't know if he would critique, people not constructing the environment for this to happen, or if he would just critique the man for not being disciplined, right? Like he says he invokes self-mastery. And that's what I was saying, like, I think he does to some degree agree with like that modern notion that we would apply it, but he uses language. He uses language that doesn't necessitate that from like,
But I thought that this was what Adam initially brought up, where it consists in positive freedom consists in both conceiving goals and realizing them.
Yeah, I guess my point is like he seems to suggest that, like, I mean, you just quoted him, but he doesn't stress that.
To be fair, it's like a very short section of the paper, so I'm not sure that the fact that he doesn't stress it means it's not still.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that
through the heart of what he's saying.
I feel like it was stressed though, because like the first paragraph was him explaining what positive freedom is, and then the later paragraphs kind of, he brings up how positive freedom can then conflict with negative freedom. You know what I mean? So I feel like that first paragraph really was him laying out, okay, here's what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? I don't know though.
I think that the psychological aspect of it is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, in the sense that he says you must be able to both conceive, that would be the psychological state of being able to actually desire these things, and then bring them about, being you can't be an insane person just, I think I could be an astronaut, but that not being in the realm of possibilities. So I think it is really the twofold conditions there that are the case for positive freedom. Like,
I think that's a good conception,
because I take it that if everyone in North Korea thinks that they really could visit Japan if only they wanted to, but they just don't. Berlin would be like, no, that's not real positive freedom just because you think you could visit Japan if you wanted to,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we just kind of got a little mixed up earlier, because it's like, okay, why would someone, the question was like, why would someone curtail negative freedoms?
Yeah.
And I think it wouldn't be through the lens of maximizing positive freedom. That wouldn't be the lens when we do it. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
But I do agree with your perspective that to have positive freedom, it needs to be actualized.
Yeah.
So, or it could be actualized reasonably.
Just in thinking about talking about the negative aspects of freedom, I don't think we really have to move through it systematically, because a lot of it has come out in what we're talking about already. I mean, were there any aspects of the discussion of negative freedom that you guys thought that we should talk about?
That seemed the more intuitive section.
It did. I did want to talk about this though, because I found this very interesting. So this is on page 170. About halfway through that long paragraph at the start, he says the use or this use of the term being negative freedom, depends on a particular social and economic theory about the causes of my poverty or weakness. If my lack of material means is due to my lack of mental or physical capacity, then I begin to speak of being deprived of freedom, and not simply about poverty, only if I accept the theory. I think the theory is the one he put forth. If, in addition, I believe that I'm being kept in want by way of specific arrangement, which I consider unjust or unfair, I speak of economic slavery or oppression. And this is what I was talking to you guys, I think it was off air about, where if you're actually so poor that you're prevented from getting a job because you can't kind of plan that far in the future because you're living literally hand to mouth, then he's almost saying like you can be deprived of positive freedom to a point where it becomes negative freedom, actually. Like and that's me reading into him here, but
you can be deprived of positive freedom to the point where it infringes on negative freedom.
Yeah, or it almost kind of transforms into a lack of negative freedom.
Okay, yeah. I didn't hear the lack in the negative freedom part.
Yeah.
Say you lose so much positive freedom, you just
obtain
negative freedom.
Maybe I misspoke. No, it's the
no one infringes on anything that I can
do. Yeah, sorry. Continue.
Because that's what I was talking to you about, Giffin, where we were trying to look for that the name of that term, where you're so poor that you can only afford to buy a very inexpensive car, which is then prone to break down more often than a new car would. So your cost of ownership is more expensive than the wealthy person's car, actually. And that continual loss of income.
Like a poverty trap.
Oh, that's it. That's
Didn't
the term.
I call it the poverty trap?
Did you?
Did you?
Maybe
I didn't hear it.
I didn't. Okay.
But if you did, then that would make sense why I would use those words, because I came to mind there. So
I don't think that part was recorded, so we'll never know.
Bummer.
We'll never know. Maybe Giffin instilled the positive freedom in you to be able to say that.
I say it and it was kind of like, no, not quite. Adam says, it's like, really God, it's here. It's been delivered.
I honestly didn't hear it, but you might have said it while we were talking. So therefore I kind of heard you, and then that's what primed me to say it.
This was like prior to the recording, not just now.
We'll never know. And the interesting thing is that, so he kind of talked about, remember I said there's almost those three conditions of coercion, which is that one of them is that it's by other beings, human beings. But what he just said in that paragraph, I think is a really interesting and congruent way of saying, look, you could have this very simplistic view of coercion or negative freedom, where it's like, oh, someone is stopping me from entering this store or whatever. But I think he's in this paragraph kind of pointing to, no, look, negative freedom can be restricted from other human beings, but through these very abstract and indirect causes, like the poverty trap, for instance, or like that psychological fact that we also talked about off air, where if studies have shown that if you're stressed monetarily and you're extremely poor, you actually lack mental faculties that you otherwise would have, presumably, to future reason about things. So that's sort of, I took that as being a really interesting point of, look, that this lack of negative freedom can present itself in non-obvious ways. Tension between positive and negative. I don't know if there was were there any other interesting kind of notes about the negative freedom that either of you want to talk about?
No, I think it was pretty clear.
I'm like looking for notes.
I'd like to add one quote. So Giffin, I think you specifically mentioned this, but he's really, when we were talking about the trade-off between positive and negative freedoms, it
Yeah.
really is just a very practical issue. It's not he's almost, now I don't know if he actually does this in his other work, but in here it seems like he's kind of eschewing a concept of like an unalienable right. Right. He's saying like,
yeah,
these are pragmatic concerns we've got to figure out. And he says, I like the language where it being the balance, where the balance is to be drawn as a matter of argument, indeed of haggling.
no, he basically says what an inalienable right is just, whatever the bounds you make, and it'll be different for different people.
Yeah. He seemed to be almost implicitly endorsing a kind of Hobbesian view of society as an escape from the state of nature. It's like we're all kind of coming together and agreeing to restrict certain negative freedoms in order to reap the benefit of positive freedoms, and that frees us from that very animalistic state.
I don't know enough about him to know if he had like Hobbesian inclinations, but that does seem to.
I don't know.
There is almost a sense of that. You're right.
Yeah. I'm just looking through my notes real quick. Oh, okay. I liked this too. Okay. So on page 172, top of the next paragraph.
Yeah.
He says, what troubles the consciences of Western liberals is, I think, the belief not that the freedom that men seek differs according to their social or economic conditions, but that the minority who possess it have gained it by exploiting, or at least averting their gaze from, the vast majority who do not. And that was an amazing a priori prediction of exactly what Jonathan Haidt has found in his Giffin. I don't think you're aware of this, but Jonathan Haidt and Craig Joseph, building off of the work of a cultural anthropologist, Rick Schwader, found that there are these kind of 5 incommensurate values that people tend to hold. Sure. I don't know if I can remember them. There's harm, there's fairness, there's oppression, there's purity, and there's sanctity. I think those are the 5. And there's been since added another foundation. Oh no, I think the 6th foundation was liberty or oppression. So I'm missing one. Harm, fairness. Oh, authority. And it's actually crazy because what the empirical data that Haidt found is that liberals, or people who identify as progressive on the left, whatever, are off the charts in caring about harm or fairness, but they do not care about authority, sanctity, or purity standards, which is very interesting.
That actually is interesting.
I just thought it was so cool that in 57, Berlin predicted perfectly, just from the armchair, what Jonathan Haidt would find in, I think, the early 2000s, And actually, okay, maybe this is what we can end on. I actually think that the left, just talking in the political climate we're in today, I think the left's rhetoric actually really suffers for a lack of these distinctions.
Yeah. He says it in the middle of this paragraph. But nothing is gained by a confusion of terms, right? He says to avoid glaring inequality or widespread misery, I am ready to sacrifice some or all of my freedom. I may do so willingly and freely, but it is freedom that I am giving up for the sake of justice or equality or the love of my fellow men, right? I should be guilt-stricken, and rightly so, if I were not, in some circumstances, ready to make this sacrifice. But a sacrifice is not an increase in what is being sacrificed, namely freedom.
Yes,
nothing is gained. He is a good critique, and it's still apt.
Yes, it's really apt right now, because here's the thing: is like, I mean, you look at, let's just use a really current example: Biden's rhetoric around the COVID vaccines, right? I don't have any evidence to support this, but just thinking about it, look, you're someone who has a conservative bend, right? You feel as though there's something that you're giving up, but obviously you've never read Berlin. You don't know all of this, right? But there is this sort of negative feeling that you have. And then all that's talked about is this conflation that people on the left tend to put forth, which is only about positive freedoms, right? We need freedom too, and they're absolutely right. But I don't know. I almost think that a very candid discussion of like, look, that there are positive and negative freedoms. It's just exactly what the quote just said.
Yeah. You bring those people into your moral community by by acknowledging that negative freedoms exist.
Yeah,
right.
And
it's like you can't if you treat it as just like a line, and it's like we are moving forward in the line. Like it's just kind of patronizing to people who are like, even if they can't articulate it, like, well, no, they're like it's a loss of something.
Yeah,
Putting aside the idea that the personal responsibility might dictate the result of the mandate. Anyways.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think, like, to be fair though, a lot of people on the left do speak like this. They might not introduce things like positive freedoms, but I've heard many people, including myself, even before leaving Berlin, like I've
chest out, like
but the thing is, like, I've made very similar arguments where it's like, okay, you acknowledge, like, I've had many conversations where I've acknowledged that, okay, you are giving up this type of freedom. I didn't have this distinction between positive and negative freedom, but you acknowledge that, okay, you are giving this up for some different thing that we value ultimately, whether it's, okay, the general social welfare or, the consequences of this or just whatever, right?
Equality, fairness, justice, culture, whatever, all the things he lists.
Sure. But I've actually seen, like, this is just, my personal anecdotes here, but it would be like, I just haven't gotten like a lot of good reception from that. It's just
really?
Generally,
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess it could be one of those things where it's actually overdetermined, where you're just never gonna change people's minds.
Yeah.
Maybe this sounds more elitist than it needs to be, but it's like maybe it really is only for the people who are thinking about it, for lack of a better term. You know what I mean? Like,
sure.
Look, the whatever percent of the Republicans who haven't gotten the vaccine at this point, there's probably not. But Berlin himself could just reemerge, and he's not going to convince them to take it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, all things being equal, I do think that this language is lacking in a lot of the conversation from the left today.
Yeah. Especially this, like, the distinction between positive and negative freedom.
Actually,
yeah.
This language alone kind of allows you to explain that issue. You simply say, like, this is a group of people who have, like, more and more decided on, like, the value of negative freedom is widened, like, is so much greater in value than, like, the positive freedom, right? That's a way to kind of describe it. And it's like there's a kind of separation in the communities, right? And that causes a lot of tension, because it's like, for some people, it's like, I'm giving up a little bit of this to get an immense amount of that for an immense amount of people. And the other person's like, the value of, any negative freedom is infinite. So it's like, there is no calculus. It's like, let's. And
that comes back to my point about, well, I actually think that your rational best self would endorse this, right, if you experienced both things.
Yeah, and it's like I just keep thinking, like, we already do this. You know what I mean? Like, the language, like this distinction is really good. Like, love the paper, but like we've already, like, explained to people for like a year and a half that, like, okay, like, why do you wear a mask in a store? Like, why is it required? It's so that, the elderly woman shopping can feel comfortable and free to shop at the store, right? Like, there's like a comfort level that we're
so
trying
that she can have those positive freedoms.
Exactly. So that she can, like, in this case, it's a pretty modest goal, but the goal of going to the store and shopping without the fear of dying.
Not being oppressed.
So, exactly.
Modest indeed.
Anderson would say, like, you're just oppressing people.
Yeah.
Sure. So, but it's like we already kind of laid that out before, and people are like, don't care. So,
I mean, I agree that some
like,
people do, but I do think, like, in general, especially, like, I mean, our media consumption is vastly different than the average Americans. Like, you got to imagine, like, does this language make it into the sound bites? No. Does that mean that it, for 50% of Americans, it doesn't make it in there at all? Yeah. Like, it basically does.
Does Biden come at his next presser ruffling papers of two concepts of liberty?
Yeah.
No, he just
as
panders.
The stormtroopers are sent down. It's for your positive freedom, don't you understand?
I've got... What negative freedom?
Giffin just immediately put it to use by the notion of positive liberty.
God, you've got like an AR-15 to your like temple. Just like brush your teeth. Your rational self would endorse it.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more, my man.
Adam trembling as he's brushing, but it's a Frankfurt case, sir. I would have done it anyway. Oh, all right. Well, we haven't had one of these episodes in a while where we read a short text and it is just sort of a package of I actually think this is one of those examples where the semantics you use to think or talk about something do actually change how you think about it. And I like these episodes. I'm glad that we had this style of one again.
Yeah. Now that
Totally
it's been
agree.
like
It's a good one.
crystallized, this is like these are concepts that will be applied, very liberally.
Yes. Yes. All right. Well, I don't know what we're doing next, but I hope that everyone listening enjoyed this episode and will tune in for the next one. So until then. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Plato's Cave. I always enjoy discussing topics with these two guys. So if you want to support the show in any way, you can do so simply by sharing it. I'm hoping to get this show out to more people. And so if you want to share it on Twitter or social media, that would really help me. You can also rate it on Apple Podcasts. Like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe via Apple Podcasts or an RSS feed. You can also discuss it on your own show and link back to my website, or you can connect me with recommended guests or topics to cover. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And I now have a website for my philosophy endeavors at jordanmyers.org. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my fellow co-hosts, as I said in the introduction, I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. I did my undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, where I studied mechanical engineering and philosophy. And now that I'm back at school, I'm hoping to more closely study moral responsibility, free will, ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology. Those are topics that I was introduced to and got really interested in my undergrad work. So Adam and Giffin accompanied me on this show, and Adam is one of my oldest friends. We actually met in kindergarten, and we've been interested in philosophical topics for as long as we can remember, and in a lot of ways it's been the basis of our friendship. Adam studied chemistry and biology at Cornell, and he is currently working at a law firm. And he's especially interested in moral responsibility as well, but also law, religion, and free will. Giffin is also one of my oldest friends, and we've been friends since elementary school as well. Giffin studied biology and economics at RPI, and now he works in human health research. He believes that there's very interesting overlap between both of his fields of study and philosophy, and he's particularly interested in exploring political philosophy. So this series was right up his alley. And with all of that information, again, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you get in contact with me or follow my work in any way that you deem reasonable to do. So with that, thank you for listening.